So we're talking about toe angle, how it relates to squatting, and how that can affect everything up, because people don't understand what torque at the hip means. And it took me a long time to actually visualize what that means from an anatomical and mechanic perspective, because torque is a rotational force instead of just shear compression or tension. So over here I was showing Mike, because Mike has kind of stiff ankles. This thing Kelly talks about just having anterior distraction on the ankle, going to acute, and then trying to get the knee out laterally, or the shin out laterally with respect to the ankle, and then doing it the opposite way to have that posterior distraction, because that's something that can help open up the ankle. Because if someone's squatting, and regardless of their toe angle, if they're trying to get their knees out and then their foot is doing this, where their foot comes up off the ground, then that's obviously not conducive to squatting, because it means that they're not stable on the ground. So to account for that, this lack of flexibility, which we could just focus on the ankle right here, to account for that, they would have to get their toes out, right, in order to get the same positioning so that they can get their knees out in the bottom of a squat. Whether it's a fucking low bar position or a high bar position or a front squat position, they would have to get their toes out. But the problem with the toes being out is that it doesn't distribute the force evenly across the thigh. So because that torque isn't there. So in this position with the toes more forward and then we're getting the knees out, we get better distribution across the thigh, especially to the lateral portion and the lateral portion of the hamstrings, whereas those might be left out in the event of having a really toes out position. So toes out position, kind of like low bar, driving the ass up, it's a lot of adductor and medial aspect of the hamstring, but it kind of neglects this lateral portion of the hamstring. So if the person was able to have a more forward toe angle, not necessarily forward and obviously not in, but right outside of forward, 10 degrees, assuming they had the mobility to do it, then when they have their knees shoved out and then they have the ankle flexibility to do it, they have the flexibility to do it up through these structures, through the shin and then through the IT and this lateral portion of the thigh, anterior and posterior, and then most importantly in the external rotators of the hips, actually externally rotate. And then I guess you could also consider the adductors having the flexibility to actually stretch, because if they're tight, then they're not going to allow this knee to get out because they're going to hold it in. So all this shit matters in order to have good mobility, to have a more forward toe angle position in the squat. And when someone does have that, whether they are more of a high bar or more of a low bar, which again, low bar would kind of be more here, and then high bar, it's hard to do without the heels, without my stripper heels on. But when you're in this position for a high bar, it distributes the force more evenly across not only the quadriceps but the hamstrings, because it's possible to have hamstrings on the high bar, and that's a misconception that they're not engaged, but they're not going to be engaged if there's a collapsed position and then the person has their knees, in other words, collapsed position, and then the knees are coming in. That's solely going to be this medial aspect of the knee. Whereas if we have good foot position with good knee position, and we're driving up through the heels, we have this distribution through the lateral portion of the thigh, but also the hamstrings, especially the proximal aspect, help the glutes to hold the back angle in place. So when you're here and you're driving up a high bar, you're thinking driving the heels, this stuff is on right here. It's different because you're not thinking push the butt to extend the hip, but that stuff is on to hold the back angle in place. But it's all dependent on the mobility of everything, starting from the ground all the way up. And that could even play into someone's mobility in their back and how it relates it down, the lumbar coming down in the sacrum. It can even go up to the lats, because if the lats are short, then it's not going to allow certain positions to maintain a neutral spine the entire time. So the fucking point is that for the most efficient style of squatting that's going to use the most musculature, it's not just where the bar is on the back, and it's not just getting into any kind of position to make that happen, because that's just putting a band-aid over the wound. Getting the toes out to 30 degrees to low bar, it's just a band-aid over the problem, and the underlying problem is a lack of mobility to do it properly. All pointing the toes out does is it allows the person to get their knees out more, because they don't have the mobility to keep them out with the toes more forward. And so that's what fucking torque at the hip means, is because when the toes are more forward in a proper position here, the knees are out, and so it's producing this like torque at the hip because external rotation is doing this at the hip in my right hip, and so that tightens up this because it's stretched, distributes the force evenly across the lateral portion of the thigh, distributes the force evenly across the lateral portion of the hamstring, and fucking is more efficient. I'm pretty spent now.
So is mine.